The era of good feelings ended in basically 1828, but the beginning of the end was in 1824 when the Democratic Republicans, in their decade, or roughly a decade of being the only political party in the American system, are going to stop having a full hold on things. In fact, they're pretty much going to die as a unified party altogether. And the election of 1824 is the beginning of that. Today's essential question: why did the elections of 1824 and 1828 signal a turning point in American political history? And mostly that can be summed up with the existence of one man, and we will cover his thoughts and thinking and the reason why he divided the system in this presentation. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans basically ended up with three major candidates all running for president, the first being Henry Clay from Kentucky. As we have discussed previously, his American system was intended to use the federal government to expand the business side of American economics, and basically also expand the infrastructure of this country. In many ways, his plans were similar to that of Alexander Hamilton that we talked about earlier this year. And Clay, despite the fact that he'll run for president 4 times, will never win, but he will be one of the main figures that will stand up for and speak out for the national government's role in all facets of American life. Similar to Clay was the thinking of John Quincy Adams, also a nationalist, and really formed that part of the party in the northeast of the country. However, Clay is a Westerner from Kentucky, and John Quincy Adams is from the northeast. They both have similar thinking, but they both represent different regions of the country. Who likely would have been the Southern candidate would have been William Crawford of Georgia, but he has a stroke midway through this election process, and obviously that removes him from being a legitimate candidate, causes Southerners to seek someone else to represent their party, and that's when they turn to Andrew Jackson. And Jackson will, like Clay, be from the West, but he is the antithesis of Clay's thinking, Clay being a nationalist, and Jackson much so being a states' rights advocate. A hero of the War of 1812, a hero of Indian Wars. There are all sorts of really interesting and sometimes bizarre background stories on Andrew Jackson. We will cover those more as we move forward, but for the time being, just understand him to be a states' rights advocate that will pick up the void left by the stroke had by William. Here's the final election statistics. You see where different pieces of the country will give their votes. Notice that Crawford still does take some states in their electoral votes, but Jackson does very well across the rest of the South and parts of the West. But the highly populated Northeast is where we see John Quincy Adams do most of his damage. And with their electoral votes being much more numerous, Adams seems to lead the way. Now, with that said, this is the second time in history, as we talked about before, with 1800 being the first, that no one wins a majority of the electors in the Electoral College, and therefore the House of Representatives chooses the winner of this election. When John Quincy Adams eventually becomes president, it's most likely because Henry Clay suggested to those in the House that supported him that they go ahead and vote for John Quincy Adams. This is the logical choice simply because in both their cases, they're a more nationalist candidate. They both support the power of the federal government. They came from different regions, have a little bit different ideas about how to use the federal government's power to promote national interests. However, they definitely pair up much more than Jackson does. Jackson, though, sees this as a scam and as a scheme, and he especially feels that way once John Quincy Adams is inaugurated and immediately appoints Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. He called this a corrupt bargain. Jackson, that is, called it a corrupt bargain. He thought it was a total backroom deal, that the two opponents in the situation worked together to create an opportunity for Adams to become president and Clay to become Secretary of State, all at Jackson's expense. So he's so angry, he immediately sets his mind on being elected to president 4 years later in the next election in 1828. He resigns from the Senate so he can be in the process. Now, John Quincy Adams is, much like his dad, not much of a character, not very interesting in personality, dry, elitist, very intelligent, but yet does not relate well with just about anybody. The antithesis of Jackson, who is as backwoods and as country as a politician really can be at this time. But John Quincy Adams going to suffer the same exact fate as his dad, John Adams. They will be the first two presidents to not be elected to a second term. So like father, like son, they're not going to be able to expand their plans and their political ideas beyond one term as president. The only father-son presidents that we've ever had, other than George Bush and George Bush. His presidency is marked by the fact that Jackson is always in the papers and out in the public opposing just about everything that Adams does, and constantly reminding the public that in 4 years he's going to run against him again. But probably the death knell to John Quincy Adams' presidency is his signing of what Southerners called the Tariff of Abominations. This tariff was actually the largest tariff in U.S. history. It was passed by Congress in 1828, the exact year of the 1828 election. And hence the official name of it is the Tariff of 1828, but Southerners call it the Tariff of Abominations because it is so high that most countries will raise their tariffs in response. You'll remember that that is a term called tariff retaliation, and because of it, Southern exports of cotton and tobacco lose many of their markets because it becomes so expensive in places like France and England to send your agricultural goods into those countries. So because of that, the Southerners are very upset about this tariff. They see it as something that someone in the Northeast would do. Remember as well, what is the biggest purpose of a large protective tariff? It's not to gain revenue, but instead to keep foreign goods out. And the growing and budding industrial side of northern cities and northern states benefit from such a tariff because it keeps foreign goods out. It protects those industries that are little baby industries, those infant industries that are just starting in cities like Philadelphia and Boston and New York, where those businesses can make more money because foreign competition's been eliminated. So Southerners definitely see this as a slap to their face. In all likelihood, this is the biggest reason that John Quincy Adams will struggle to get elected in 1828. When he does lose this election, and there goes your suspense, he's going to lose to Andrew Jackson in 1828. He'll be the only president to ever return to Congress. He'll spend 17 years in the House of Representatives representing the state of New York in Congress, and will continue to be a lead character there. In fact, his thinking and his ideas will often bring compromise to otherwise hairy situations. So we'll hear from him again, just not as President of the United States. Here's the actual election numbers. This election is one of the first examples of just nastiness. This election we're here in 2016 witnessing is probably putting this to shame, but personal attacks, attacks on each other's wives, accusations of bigamy, adultery, just about anything you could think of, flying back and forth between the candidates. Jackson was going to pull out all the stops he possibly could. If Adams failed at anything other than signing the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, it was likely that he was not willing to get his hands dirty like Andrew Jackson was, and much of the public, particularly the more common middle class and lower class economic folks in the country, identified with the way Jackson approached this and certainly listened to things he had to say, whereas Adams just failed miserably to be able to relate to those sorts of voters. You can see the statistics there. Almost 70% of the electors go to Jackson. This is a blowout in just about every sense, and John Quincy Adams' presidency. Now, what this means going forward is why we see a two-party political system return and an end of the era of good feelings. Andrew Jackson is often called the father of the modern party. That's because he appeals to common people. He appeals to those that are anti-elitist, your Western farmers, your Southern farmers, your middle-class shopkeepers and businessmen, basically all these different people who are not big business type people, not major city dwellers, not corporate thinkers, and really any of the elite of society. He will intentionally try to find as much as he can these sort of voters and bring them out into the process, not only to try to get states to give them the right to vote. In some states they still could not, but also just to convince them that politics and being a part of this process is something that they should do. For many people like that in years past, they had not felt welcome or really seen a purpose in being involved politically. Westerners, Southerners, particularly immigrants, these folks have always been the basis of the Democratic Republican Party, but they will coalesce in a different way than what you had seen done previously. Martin Van Buren is a New Yorker. Despite the fact that he's a Northerner, his states' rights viewpoints will match up with Jackson's, and he'll kind of be the right-hand man. On the other side of things, you have Northern businessmen and then very, very wealthy Southern plantation owners. They will be what we call the Whigs. Jackson was particularly, because of his upbringing and his young life, being raised by a single mother, pretty hateful toward Southern plantation owners, had lots of resentment toward the wealthy elite of the South, and immediately becomes almost an enemy of them with things he will say personally and also his policies and his ideas. The Whigs see Andrew Jackson as basically king. He handled the king of the paupers. He handled the common people and brought them in such large droves that he almost could manipulate them to do whatever he wanted and vote for whatever he wanted. And the Whigs felt like, in a way, they were opposing this kind of action, particularly the bringing in of such common people. Remember that in the Revolutionary War, the folks that supported the king in Parliament were called Tories, but those in the Parliament in Britain who were against the king and his policies were called Whigs. So, in that same tradition, the people who opposed King Andrew Jackson, also decided to call themselves Whigs and stood against his policies. They would, just like those British parliamentarians, wear wigs on occasion at their meetings and rallies to signify. Henry Clay will become one of the lead Whigs, not surprisingly. The Whigs will also support national policies and the role of the federal government in a way that Andrew Jackson would never want to do. Daniel Webster is another Northerner who will represent these sorts of ideas. They will be the key. So, with that in mind, quickly jot down your thoughts here in a quick write. Which party do you think you would have belonged to in the 1830s? Would you have been a Whig, or would you have been a Democrat? And do note that with the change in the role of the Democratic Republican, to a more dominant aspect of things toward common people, that they will stop being called Democratic Republicans in the way that Thomas Jefferson brought their name and moniker, and instead will just drop the Republican part of the name and just become Democrats. That party of Jackson still today is the same Democratic Party. It is no longer the states' rights party. It is no longer a party that opposes federal government control. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We will see that in about 100 years from the 1830s and the 1930s, you very much see the Democrats change the way they approach things. We'll get to that later, but for now, based on what you know, which party would you belong to? The Democratic Republicans or the Whigs? Take 5 minutes, begin writing.